The snow fell in heavy, silent flakes, blanketing the world in a hush that felt like the universe holding its breath. It was 5:17 a.m. on Christmas morning, and I stood frozen in the doorway of our small, creaky house, staring at the taillights of my parents' car fading into the gray dawn. The cold bit at my fingertips, but it was nothing compared to the chill spreading through my chest. They had done it. They had actually done it. My parents had loaded Grandpa into the car at 5 a.m., driven him to some godforsaken nursing home on the edge of town, and left him there. No goodbye, no explanation, just a suitcase, a pat on the shoulder, and the slam of a car door. I was 22, home from college for the holidays, and I thought I knew my family. I thought I understood the people who raised me. But standing there, my breath fogging in the frigid air, I realized I didn't know them at all. Grandpa, 80 years old, with hands that still trembled from years of carpentry and a laugh that could light up a room, had been discarded like an old piece of furniture. My parents had spent weeks whispering about how he was too much to handle, how his forgetfulness and slow steps were dragging us down. I'd overheard their arguments, their sighs, but I never thought they'd go this far. Not on Christmas. Not like this. The house was too quiet when I stepped back inside. The Christmas tree blinked in the corner, its lights casting a mocking glow over the unopened presents. Grandpa's gift, a hand-knitted scarf I'd spent weeks making, sat under the tree, untouched. My chest tightened as I pictured him out there, alone, his kind eyes probably searching the horizon for a car that wasn't coming back. I grabbed my coat, my keys, and the scarf. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I couldn't just stand there. I couldn't let him think we'd all given up on him. The drive to the nursing home was a blur of snow and streetlights. My old hatchback skidded on the icy roads, but I barely noticed. My mind was racing, replaying every moment I'd spent with Grandpa. He'd taught me how to whistle, how to carve a bird from a block of wood, how to find joy in the smallest thing, so warm mug of cocoa, a bad joke, a shared silence. He wasn't perfect. His memory had started slipping. He'd call me by my mother's name sometimes, or forget where he parked his glasses. But he was still Grandpa. He was still ours. When I pulled into the parking lot of Sunset Pines nursing home, the place looked like a prison masquerading as a hospital. Gray concrete walls, a flickering neon sign, and a single bench where Grandpa sat, hunched against the cold. His suitcase was at his feet, and his hands were clasped tightly, as if holding himself together. I parked crookedly, threw open the door, and ran to him. "Grandpa," I whispered, dropping to my knees in front of him. His face lifted, and the pain in his eyes broke something inside me. "Ellie," he said, his voice cracking. What are you doing here?" "They left you," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "They just left you here, and I'm so sorry." Tears stung my eyes as I wrapped the scarf around his neck, my fingers trembling. He didn't say anything, just looked at me with those tired, gentle eyes. I wanted to scream, to demand answers from the universe, but all I could do was hug him. His coat smelled of sawdust and peppermint, the same as always. "I'm not leaving you here," I said, my voice fierce despite the tears. "You're coming with me." Grandpa shook his head, his hands gripping mine. "Ellie, your parents, they think it's for the best. I don't want to cause trouble." Trouble. The word made my blood boil. He wasn't trouble. He was family. I stood, pulling him gently to his feet. "You're not trouble, Grandpa, and I'm not letting you spend Christmas on a bench." The car ride back was quiet, but not the empty kind of quiet. It was the kind where you feel someone's presence so deeply it fills the space. Grandpa stared out the window, his fingers tracing the edge of the scarf. You didn't have to do this. Ellie, he said softly. I know I'm not what I used to be. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. You're enough, I said. You've always been enough. When we pulled into the driveway, the house was still dark, but I could see the faint glow of the Christmas tree through the window. My parents' car wasn't back yet. Good. I didn't want to face them. Not yet. I helped Grandpa inside, settling him on the couch with a blanket and a mug of tea. His hands shook as he held it, but he smiled a small, grateful smile that made my heart ache. What now, Ellie? He asked. I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let this go. Not without a fight. The clock on the mantel ticked towards 6:30 a.m., each second a reminder that my parents would be back soon. I sat across from Grandpa, watching him sip his tea, his eyes distant but calm. The Christmas lights flickered, casting soft shadows on his weathered face. I wanted to ask him what he was thinking, what it felt like to be driven away in the dark, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I busied myself making breakfast pancakes, his favorite. The smell of batter sizzling on the griddle filled the kitchen, a small act of defiance against the morning's cruelty. As I flipped a pancake, the front door creaked open. My parents' voices drifted in, low and tense, like they were already bracing for a fight. I froze, spatula in hand, as their footsteps approached. Mom appeared first, her face pale and drawn, followed by Dad, who looked like he hadn't slept in days. They stopped dead when they saw Grandpa on the couch, the scarf still around his neck. Ellie. Mom's voice was sharp, almost accusing. What is he doing here? I set the spatula down, my hands shaking with a mix of fear and fury. What is he doing here? I repeated, my voice louder than I intended. You left him, Mom. You and Dad dumped him at a nursing home at 5 a.m. on Christmas. What were you thinking? Dad stepped forward, his jaw tight. Ellie, you don't understand. It's not that simple. He needs care we can't give him. Care? I snapped, stepping closer. You didn't even tell him what was happening. You didn't tell me. You just threw him away. My voice broke, and I hated how young I sounded. How powerless. Grandpa cleared his throat, his voice soft but steady. Let's not fight. Now. It's Christmas. But I couldn't stop. The anger was too raw, too deep. No. Grandpa. They don't get to do this and pretend it's okay. Mom's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't back down. Ellie, you're at college. You don't see how hard it's been. He forgets things, wanders off, breaks things. We're drowning. Her words hit like a punch, but they didn't justify what they'd done. I looked at Grandpa, who was staring at his hands, shame creeping into his expression. He's not a burden, I said quietly. He's family. The argument spiraled from there, voices rising until the kitchen felt like a battlefield. Dad talked about medical bills and Mom's stress. Mom talked about how Grandpa's dementia was getting worse. I countered with every memory I had of him teaching me to fish, telling stories about his days as a carpenter, singing off-key Christmas carols. They weren't listening. They were too caught up in their own exhaustion, their own reasons. Finally, I slammed my hand on the counter. If you can't take care of him, I will. The words hung in the air, heavy and reckless. I hadn't planned to say them, but as soon as they left my mouth, I knew I meant them. Mom's eyes widened. Ellie, you're 22. You have school, a life. You can't. I can. I interrupted. And I will. If you don't want him here, I'll find a way. Grandpa reached for my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. Ellie, you don't have to do this, he whispered. But I squeezed his hand back. I want to. The rest of the morning was a blur of tense silences and half-hearted attempts at Christmas cheer. We opened presents, but the joy was gone. Grandpa tried to keep things light, joking about the pancakes being almost as good as mine. But I could see the weight on him. My parents avoided my eyes, their guilt palpable but unspoken. I didn't care. My mind was already racing. Planning. I had a small savings account from my part-time job, enough to rent a cheap apartment. I could take a semester off, find work, figure out how to care for Grandpa. It wouldn't be easy, but it was better than letting him rot in some sterile facility. By noon, I'd made up my mind. I pulled Grandpa aside while my parents were cleaning up. I'm serious, I told him. We're leaving. I'll find us a place. Just you and me. His eyes searched mine, a mix of pride and worry. Ellie, you're young. You've got your whole life ahead of you. I smiled, though it felt brittle. And I want you in it. The next few days were a whirlwind of determination and doubt. I spent hours on my laptop, scouring rental listings and job boards, my heart pounding with the weight of what I'd promised. Grandpa stayed quiet, watching me with a mix of gratitude and guilt. He tried to help making coffee, folding laundry, but I could see the fear in his eyes, the worry that he was dragging me down with him. I hated that he felt that way. I hated that my parents had made him feel that way. By New Year's Eve, I'd found a small apartment an hour away, a one-bedroom unit in a rundown building that was all I could afford. It wasn't much a leaky faucet, peeling paint, but it was ours. I used my savings for the deposit and first month's rent, and I landed a job as a barista at a local cafe. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. I told Grandpa the plan over dinner, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. We move in next week, I said. It's not fancy, but it's home. He nodded, his eyes misty. You're too good to me, Ellie. Packing was harder than I expected. Every item in Grandpa's room, his old toolbox, his faded flannel shirts, the wooden birds we'd carved together felt like a piece of history I was trying to preserve. My parents didn't help. They hovered, offering half-hearted apologies and warnings about how hard this would be. You're throwing away your future, Mom said one night, her voice tight. You think you can handle this, but you don't know what it's like. I didn't argue. I was too tired, too focused. I just kept packing. The move was chaotic. The apartment smelled of mildew, and the heater barely worked. But Grandpa's face lit up when he saw the tiny living room. Plenty of space for a workbench, he said, half joking. I laughed, the first real laugh in days. We spent the first night eating takeout on the floor, surrounded by boxes, talking about anything but the family we'd left behind. For the first time, I felt like I was doing something right. But reality hit hard. The barista job barely covered rent, and Grandpa's medical needs were a constant worry. His dementia wasn't severe yet, but he had bad days, moments when he'd forget where we were or call me by my mother's name. I learned to be patient, to gently remind him without making him feel small. It was exhausting, but every time he smiled or told me a story from his youth, it was worth it. He was worth it. My parents called a few times, their voices strained with guilt and concern. I kept the conversations short. I wasn't ready to forgive them, not when I could still see the image of Grandpa on that bench, abandoned. But one call from my aunt, their older sister, shook me. Ellie, what you're doing is brave, but it's tearing the family apart, she said. Your parents are a mess. They know they were wrong, but they're too proud to admit it. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to scream that they deserved it, but another part is smaller. Quieter part missed them. I started noticing changes in Grandpa, too. He was trying harder to stay sharp, writing notes to himself, helping with small chores. One evening, he pulled out an old photo album and showed me pictures of my parents when they were young. They weren't always so hard, he said softly. Life's been tough on them. I wanted to argue, to say it didn't excuse what they'd done, but I couldn't. Not when he looked at me with such quiet hope. By late January, the apartment felt more like home. I hung fairy lights in the living room, and Grandpa carved a tiny wooden bird for the windowsill. But the weight of our choice was always there. I was skipping classes, falling behind in school, and the bills were piling up. I didn't regret it, not exactly, but I was starting to feel the strain. And then, one snowy evening, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find my parents standing there, their faces pale and uncertain. The sight of my parents on the doorstep felt like a punch to the gut. Snow clung to their coats, and their eyes were heavy with something I couldn't quite read: guilt, maybe, or regret. I stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance, my heart racing. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice colder than the January air. Mom's lips parted, but no words came out. Dad cleared his throat. "We need to talk, Ellie. About everything." I didn't want to let them in. Part of me wanted to slam the door and shut them out forever. But Grandpa's voice came from behind me, soft and steady. "Let them in, Ellie. It's okay." I turned to see him standing in the living room, his hands clasped, that same tired hope in his eyes. I stepped aside, my jaw tight, and let them enter. The apartment felt smaller with all four of us crowded in the living room. Mom and Dad sat on the edge of the couch, their hands fidgeting, while Grandpa took the armchair, his posture straight despite his frailty. I stood, arms crossed, refusing to make this easy for them. "Well," I said, "say what you came to say." Mom started, her voice shaky. "We were wrong, Ellie. What we did, it was a mistake. We were overwhelmed, and we thought." She stopped, tears spilling down her cheeks. Dad picked up where she left off. "We thought we were protecting you, protecting ourselves. But we were wrong. We're sorry." The words hung in the air, heavy but not enough. I wanted to believe them, but the memory of Grandpa on that bench was still too raw. "Sorry doesn't fix it," I said, my voice trembling. "You left him. You didn't even give him a choice." Grandpa reached for my hand, his touch grounding me. "Ellie, they're here now," he said quietly. "That's something." I wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't have to forgive them so easily, but his eyes held a quiet strength that stopped me. The conversation that followed was messy, full of tears and raised voices. Mom talked about her stress, how Grandpa's dementia had scared her, how she felt like she was failing everyone. Dad admitted he'd been too focused on money, on keeping the family stable. I listened, but I didn't soften. Not yet. I told them about the apartment, the barista job, the nights I stayed up worrying about bills. "I did this because you wouldn't," I said, "because I love him." Grandpa stayed quiet for most of it, but when he spoke, his words cut through the noise. "I don't want to be a burden," he said, "but I don't want to be forgotten either. I just want to be with my family." His voice broke, and so did something inside me. I saw my parents flinch, their guilt laid bare. For the first time, I saw them not as the people who'd abandoned him, but as people who were scared, flawed, human. They stayed for hours, and by the time they left, we'd reached a fragile truce. They offered to help with rent, to pay for a part-time caregiver so I could go back to school. I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no either. After they were gone, Grandpa and I sat in silence, the weight of the day settling around us. "You didn't have to fight so hard for me," he said finally. I shook my head. "Yes, I did." The weeks that followed were a slow rebuilding. My parents started visiting, bringing groceries or helping with small repairs. It wasn't perfect. There were still arguments, still moments of resentment, but it was a start. I went back to school part-time, balancing classes with work and caring for Grandpa. He had more good days than bad, and on the good ones, we'd sit together, carving or talking, finding joy in the little things. But the cracks in our family were still there, and I knew they might never fully heal. What I'd done taking Grandpa in, standing up to my parents, had changed us all. It had shown me what I was capable of, and it had forced them to face their mistakes. We were a family, broken but trying, and maybe that was enough. Spring came slowly, the snow giving way to muddy patches and tentative buds. The apartment felt less like a hideout and more like a home, with Grandpa's wooden birds lining the windowsill and my textbooks scattered on the table. I was juggling school, work, and caregiving, but there was a rhythm to it now, a fragile balance. Grandpa was trying harder than ever to stay present, jotting notes on a small pad he carried everywhere. "Don't want to forget the important stuff," he'd say with a wink, and I'd smile, even though it hurt to see him fight so hard. My parents' visits became more regular, though the tension never fully disappeared. They'd bring dinner or sit with Grandpa while I studied, small gestures that felt like olive branches. I accepted them cautiously, still guarding the part of me that had been shattered on Christmas morning. Mom started opening up about her own fears, how she'd watched her mother fade to dementia years ago, how she was terrified of history repeating itself. Dad, quieter but no less remorseful, took Grandpa to doctor's appointments, his way of making amends. I saw their effort, but forgiveness was a slow burn, not a switch I could flip. One afternoon, Grandpa and I were in the tiny kitchen, making his famous oatmeal cookies. He was measuring flour, his hands steady for once, when he looked at me and said, "Ellie, you've given me more than I deserve." I stopped stirring, my throat tight. "Don't say that," I said. "You deserve everything." He shook his head, a sad smile on his lips. "I just wish I could give you back your freedom." I wanted to tell him he hadn't taken it, that I'd chosen this, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I hugged him, flour dusting our shirts, and we laughed through the ache. The real test came in April, when Grandpa had a bad day. He woke up confused, thinking he was back in his old workshop, calling for my dad like he was still a boy. I stayed calm, guiding him through the fog with gentle words. But it shook me. That night, I called my parents, my voice trembling. "I need help," I admitted. It was the first time I'd asked, and it felt like letting go of a weight I'd carried too long. They came over the next day, and we really talked about a plan. A caregiver for weekdays, shared responsibilities, a way to keep Grandpa with us without breaking me. By summer, we'd found a new normal. The caregiver, a kind woman named Maria, became part of our makeshift family. Grandpa liked her, especially when she laughed at his terrible puns. I was back in school full-time, catching up on credits, and my parents were more present than ever. But there were still moments when the past crept in, when I'd catch Mom staring at Grandpa with guilt in her eyes, or when Dad would hesitate before speaking, like he was afraid of saying the wrong thing. I felt it too, the shadow of that Christmas morning, but I was learning to live with it. One evening, Grandpa pulled me aside, holding a small wooden box he'd carved. "For you," he said, his voice soft but clear. Inside was a tiny bird, its wings spread like it was about to fly. "To remind you," he said, "that you're stronger than you know." I cried then, not out of sadness, but gratitude. For him, for the fight, for the family we were rebuilding, piece by piece. The road ahead wasn't easy. There were still bills, still bad days, still moments when I wondered if I'd made the right choice. But every time I looked at Grandpa, at the way his eyes lit up when he told a story or held that little notepad, I knew I had. We were a family, flawed and fractured, but held together by love. And that, I realized, was worth everything. By fall, the apartment was filled with small signs of Lithia new coat of paint, a second-hand bookshelf, a stack of Grandpa's notepads filled with his careful handwriting. We'd settled into a routine that felt almost normal, though normal was a word I'd learned to redefine. Maria came 3 days a week, giving me time to breathe, to study, to be 22 again. My parents were a constant now, not just visitors, but part of our world. It wasn't perfect. There were still arguments, still moments when the past felt too heavy, but it was ours. One crisp October morning, Grandpa woke up with a spark I hadn't seen in months. "Let's go for a walk," he said, his voice bright. I hesitated as bad days were unpredictable, but his smile was so eager I couldn't say no. We bundled up and headed to a nearby park, the leaves crunching under our feet. He talked the whole way, stories spilling out about his old carpentry jobs, his first date with Grandma, the time he built a treehouse for my dad. I listened, soaking in every word, knowing these moments were precious. At the park, we sat on a bench, the same kind I'd found him on that Christmas morning. The memory hit me hard, but I pushed it away, focusing on the warmth of his hand in mine. "Ellie," he said, his voice serious, "I need you to know something. What you did, it gave me my life back. I was ready to fade away, but you didn't let me." His words broke me open, and I leaned into him, tears falling silently. "You gave me mine, too," I whispered. When we got home, my parents were waiting, a rare surprise visit. They'd brought pumpkins to carve, a nod to a tradition we'd skipped for years. We spent the afternoon laughing, scooping out pumpkin guts, arguing over whose design was best. Grandpa's was a crooked, lopsided face, and he laughed harder than any of us when it lit up. For the first time in a long time, we felt like a family, not the one we used to be, but one we'd fought to become. Christmas came again, a year after that awful morning. I braced for the memories, but they didn't overwhelm me. We spent the day together. Grandpa, my parents, even Aunt Linda, who'd flown in. There were no grand gestures, just quiet moments, Grandpa's off-key carols, Mom's too salty ham, Dad's terrible puns. The tree glowed in the corner, and under it was a new scarf I'd knitted for Grandpa, blue this time, to match his eyes. He wrapped it around his neck, grinning, and pulled me into a hug. "You're my hero, Ellie," he whispered. I didn't feel like a hero, just a granddaughter who loved him. The year had changed us all. My parents were learning to let go of their pride, to ask for help, to listen. I was learning to balance my dreams with the weight of responsibility, to forgive without forgetting. Grandpa was fighting to hold on to himself, and we were all fighting to hold on to him. There were still hard days, bills, doctor's visits, moments when his memory slipped, but we faced them together. As I looked around the table that Christmas, I realized something. Family isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up, even when it's messy, even when it hurts. We'd lost something that morning a year ago, but we'd gained something, to a deeper kind of love, forged in the fire of our mistakes. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew we'd face it as a family. And for now, that was enough.